Number 2. Let us next consider the obligation of public social covenants. First of all, they are of moral obligation. We mean by this that covenanting is not a human invention, but possesses divine authority, that it is binding upon all and obligatory to the end of time. In proof of this statement, we appeal to the light of nature. It is a dictate of reason that men ought to dedicate themselves to Him on whom they are wholly dependent. Now, we are dependent on God, socially as well as personally, in our relative as well as our individual character. He made us, preserves us, and loads us with His benefits. Even a heathen monarch could say, quote, "He doeth according to His will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth," unquote. And Paul reminded the philosophers of Athens that certain of their own poets had said, quote, "We are also His offspring," unquote. The light of nature seems thus not obscurely to teach us the duty of vowing allegiance to Him in whom we live and move and have our being, by whom kings reign and princes decree justice. Accordingly, the mariners of Tarshish, impressed with the display of God's natural majesty in the raging of the sea, quote, "feared the Lord exceedingly, and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord, and made vows," unquote. That from Jonah 1, verse 16. In the writings of Epictetus, a heathen moralist, are also found these remarkable words, quote, "To this God ye ought to swear an oath, such as the soldiers swear to Caesar. They indeed by the inducement of their wages swear that they will value the safety of Caesar before all things. And will you, then, honored with so many and so great benefits, not swear to God, or having sworn, will you not continue steadfast?" Unquote. The argument from reason is greatly confirmed by certain scripture data. For example, God and His people are represented as standing in the mutual relations of king and subjects, husband and wife, master and servants, each of which supposes a federal compact. The idea seems also to be essentially involved in the very nature of a resolution. If, as will not surely be denied, we are at liberty to form a resolution to serve God, if we are warranted to resolve both to do certain things and not to do certain other things, what should hinder such resolution from assuming a federal form? Or rather, in what does such resolution differ essentially from a covenant? Besides, do not baptism, the Lord's Supper, ministerial ordination, and other institutes of revealed religion include in them the very spirit and essence of a vow? Personal covenanting, too, to which no saint can be a stranger, in which the believer delights to pour out his soul to the Most High, expresses his determination to keep the whole law, declares his satisfaction with the plan of grace, and signifies his acceptance of new covenant blessings, affords solid ground on which to argue the moral obligation of social federal deeds. For if it be a high and distinguishing blessing for an individual, on what principle can it be showed to be otherwise than a blessing for a family, a church, a nation to be in covenant with God? The relation in which Christ stands to both civil and ecclesiastical society may here also be adduced. As King of Zion and Prince of the kings of the earth, surely both the church and civil society are bound to recognize His authority and to express their own loyal subjection, by swearing allegiance to their lawful sovereign. These things considered, the inferential or presumptive argument must be held to be strong and conclusive. But we have more direct proof still. We can point to Scripture precepts on the subject. It is not without plausibility that the Westminster divines, in the larger catechism, regarded vowing as enjoined in the 3 first commandments of the Decalogue, a proclamation which was made by Hezekiah, and which was sent by posts throughout all Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, includes these words, quote, "Now be ye not stiff-necked as your fathers were, but yield yourselves unto the Lord." In the Hebrew, that would mean give the hand unto the Lord, and enter into His sanctuary, unquote. That from 2 Chronicles 30, verse 8. Words which, as if to teach us that the duty in question is not confined to one dispensation, are repeated in Paul's epistle to the Romans, quote, "Yield yourselves unto the Lord as those that are alive from the dead," unquote. Romans 6, verse 13. Not less explicit is the command, quote, "Vow and pay unto the Lord your God," unquote. Psalm 76, verse 11. Which appears from the connection to refer not so much to personal as social vowing. And nothing can be more direct than the injunction which, from the very terms in which it is expressed, cannot be deemed Levitical. Quote, "Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, him shalt thou serve, and to him shalt thou cleave, and swear by his name." Unquote. Deuteronomy 10, verse 20. These precepts were not a dead letter to the ancient people of God, and accordingly our argument is greatly strengthened by the examples of covenanting which occurred from time to time in former ages. No one who has read the Old Testament will deny the existence of such examples. We find the children of Israel engaging in this exercise at Horeb after being brought out of Egypt, 40 years afterward in the plains of Moab over against Jericho, at Shechem before the death of Joshua, in the reign of Jehoash, under the direction of Jehoiada, the priest, during the reigns of Josiah and of Asa, and in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Scripture examples include Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, Deuteronomy 26, verse 17, Deuteronomy 39, verses 10 through 13, Joshua 24, verses 1 through 25, 2 Kings 11, verse 17, 2 Kings 23, verses 1 and 2, as well as Nehemiah 10, verse 29. We forbear to quote the passages, as most of them either have been or will yet be adduced in other connections. On the occasions in question, however, stipulations and re-stipulations passed between God and the people. We find Jehovah, on the one hand, reminding the Israelites of their moral obligations and offering them most gracious promises, and the people, on the other hand, solemnly engaging to obey and formally vowing unto the Lord. These instances of public social vowing cannot be questioned, and as little does it admit of dispute that it is our duty to follow the footsteps of those who act under the sanction of divine approbation. But the force of these examples is thought by many to be completely nullified by alleging that covenanting was altogether a Jewish thing, and ceased with the peculiar economy of the people among whom it was originally practiced. In reply to this allegation, we have to say that the circumstance of social covenanting having been practiced by the Jews does not prove the thing to have been Jewish. We admit the fact, the inference we refuse, as forced and illegitimate. Everything done by the Jewish people cannot be regarded as Jewish. They had, of course, some things that were peculiar, but it remains to be proved that covenanting was one of their peculiarities. It will be admitted that some of the ordinances and institutions given by God to his ancient people were of a moral nature, and we hold it to be incumbent on those who set aside the arguments we have brought forward from the example of the Jews to show that the duty exemplified was not moral, but ceremonial. Everything under the law was either moral, ceremonial, or judicial. Covenanting was not judicial, as everyone will admit, partaking as it did much more of a religious than a civil character. Neither was it ceremonial and typical, else we should have had its antitype under the new dispensation. It follows that it was moral, and consequently that it is binding on the people of God in all ages, as whatever is moral is necessarily of permanent obligation. Again, it cannot be shown that there was anything in the circumstances of the Jews calling for this exercise which may not exist still. Does not the Church of God possess the same nature under the one dispensation as under the other? Has it not to encounter the same enemies? Is it not exposed to the same dangers? Is it not called to the discharge of substantially the same duties? Is it not blessed with the same gracious revivals and privileges? What is there, therefore, to render covenanting inappropriate or unnecessary now? What ground is there for regarding it as Jewish and temporary? Surely that was calculated to promote public prosperity before is calculated to do the same still. The faculties, the powers, the passions, the rights, the interests of men are much the same at all times. We confess that we can discern nothing, either local or restricted, in the commands by which ancient Israel were enjoined to enter into covenant with God. And to us, it does appear to be greatly more reasonable to regard God's method of dealing with the Jews as a specimen of, rather than as an exception from, his mode of dealing with his people in general. Moreover, we have only to reflect on the advantages which covenanting is fitted to yield to be convinced that it was a privilege of no small value for the ancient church to enjoy such an ordinance. Now, that the church should be relieved from former burdensome rites and ceremonies imposed during the period of tutelage, we can easily understand. But that it should be bereft of anything in the shape of a privilege, that anything so directly tending as that of which we are now speaking, to promote the honor, the comfort, the holiness, the stability of the church, should be taken away, is what we cannot at all comprehend. It appears to us to be repugnant alike to Scripture, to reason, and to common sense. But further, is not the church the same church under the new as under the old dispensation? Men seem to forget this. They reason as if there were two churches, whereas there are only two economies. God has had but one church in the world since the fall of man. The spouse, the undefiled of Christ, is but one. The branches may differ, but the tree is the same. The olive tree into which the Gentiles were grafted, when the Jews, on account of unbelief, were broken off, was the same with that to which the descendants of these Jews are to be again united when the period of their unbelief has terminated. It follows that when the Jewish economy was abolished, the Gentiles became heirs of all the privileges secured in the covenant made with the fathers of old, and, of course, of the privileges of which we are now treating among the rest. Nay, are we not entitled to argue that if covenanting was no longer to continue in the church, it must have been abrogated? What constituted so frequent a duty and so prominent a feature before would require in this case to be formally interdicted in all time coming, else the danger would be great of the people of God being led into the sin of will worship. But do we ever read of any such interdict? Is there anything to give us the slightest hint of covenanting having been done away? To say, as is commonly done, that it is neither enjoined nor exemplified in the New Testament, even were this correct, is nothing to the purpose. The point to be settled is not whether covenanting was instituted, but whether it was abrogated at the period in question. Instituted it could not be. It existed by divine institution before. It were every whit as reasonable to demand evidence of prayer or praise having been instituted at this period, and to conclude that if it were not, they are now no longer obligatory. Our opponents have no right, we conceive, to require of us proof that covenanting was instituted in the Apostolic Church. But we hold ourselves fully entitled to demand of all such as deny the continued obligation of this exercise that they prove to us that it has been abrogated. Nor is it irrelevant here to remark that there are other religious exercises for which we have no direct authority in the New Testament. Where, we ask, is the formal command for the observance of the Sabbath on the first day of the week, or for the admission of infants to baptism, or for the dispensation of the Lord's Supper to females, or for the observance of family worship? Even then, although it were the case that the New Testament says nothing of the duty of covenanting, it would be only in this respect on a footing with other religious duties, whose obligation is never once disputed by many who are enemies to covenanting. But is it the case that covenanting is not recognized or countenanced in the New Testament? Not to speak of the apostolic injunction which we had before occasion to notice, quote, "Yield yourselves unto God," unquote, we may ask, did not the Macedonians act on the principle when, quote, "they gave their own selves to the Lord and to the church by the will of God," unquote? And have not, quote, "covenant breakers," unquote, a place in the catalogue of sinners whose conduct is denounced as displeasing to the Almighty, which could not be the case unless on the supposition of the continued obligation of covenants? That from Romans 6 verse 13, 2 Corinthians 8 verse 5, as well as Romans 1 verse 31. Prophecies respecting New Testament times greatly strengthen this argument. Such, for example, is the prediction of David, quote, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands," the form of taking an oath, "unto the Lord," unquote. Such also is that of Isaiah, quote, "In that day shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan, and swear to the Lord of hosts. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, and shall do sacrifice and oblation. Yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord, and shall perform it," unquote. And what says Jeremiah, quote, "In those days and in that time, saith the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together, going and weeping. And they shall go and seek the Lord their God. They shall ask the way to Zion with their faces thitherward, saying, Come, and let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that shall not be forgotten," unquote. That from Psalm 68 verse 31, Isaiah 29 verses 18 through 21, as well as Jeremiah 50 verses 4 and 5.